Welcome back to the Ashdonic Training Solutions page. My name is Michael. Please like our videos, subscribe, and just keep the channel going. Basically, all the support is appreciated. On this video, as promised, we're going to talk about the Mental Health Act. And this is often a topic that is very complicated. It can get a bit boring, and for some people it takes years and years of dissecting the legal frameworks underpinned in the Mental Health Act 1983. So just to make it simpler and easy to understand, especially for people who don't have as much experience in the mental health field, I'll try and talk through the different sections in a story format, and that just will make it easier. It will make it more digestible, and hopefully to make it slightly more interesting to usual take on the Mental Health Act. So for the purpose of this video, I'm going to use my name as an example of a storyline through the Mental Health Act and some of the things that may transpire during that process. So I'll start off with a situation where I'm found acting bizarre and I'm in a public place. What might happen at that point is the police may get called, and the police will come, and from their assessment they can say actually something is not quite right. This person may need an assessment to see if there's a presence of a mental disorder. What might happen in that case is then the police will convey me to a place of safety. Now that place of safety would then invoke what we call the section 136 of the Mental Health Act. Now what the 136 part of the Mental Health Act does is that it allows for a Mental Health Act assessment to be carried out, and that will give us a timeline of 24 hours from the point at which they're accepted in the 136 suite. In this process, the people in the 136 will have a few duties that they need to carry out. First of all, they need to make sure that the patient is safe. There's no presence of a physical health disorder. They're not drunk, they're not under any drugs, or anything that might inhibit the ability to carry out a Mental Health Act assessment. Once satisfied that this person is fit and they're able to engage with the assessment, then you can then make that referral to your approved Mental Health Act practitioners to arrange a Mental Health Act assessment under the Mental Health Act. In this process, the practitioners are to keep me safe, assessing my mental state, my mood, my behavior, documenting as much as possible to enable that assessment to be as comprehensive and robust as possible. Now, in that 24-hour period, the AMP who's been assigned to carry out the assessment will need to find 2 doctors, because to carry out a full Mental Health Act assessment, you need an AMP and you need 2 doctors. And those doctors have to be Section 12 approved. They have to have expertise in the mental health field, and it will be very important that they've got no previous acquaintance with that particular patient, in this case Michael. Once the assessors have come, they've assessed the patient, the 2 doctors can assess, and if they feel this patient is mentally disordered to a nature and degree that warrants detention under the Mental Health Act, they can then make a recommendation for detention under the Mental Health Act. If both doctors agree and they've made the recommendation for detention under the Act, the AMP can then make an application for detention under the Mental Health Act. Now, there are different sections where patients can be detained. So if this is maybe a first presentation for myself, I'm not known to services, they might detain me for assessment and treatment. So in this case, they'll detain me under Section 2 of the Mental Health Act. Now, this allows for assessment and treatment under the Mental Health Act. Now, with Section 2, the main core of the detention power allows for assessment, and it gives us 28 days to carry out that assessment. And hopefully by that 28 days, we've got some kind of a treatment plan, and we've got some kind of arrangement as to whether further detention is warranted, or sometimes in many cases, some people are discharged before that 28 days. If that decision has been made, a patient has been detained under Section 2 of the Mental Health Act, there's certain parts of the law that we need to follow to make sure that everything is happening according to the legal framework. So the first thing you want to make sure is that the patient understands that they're detained under the Mental Health Act, and you need to read them their rights. Now, reading the rights falls under Section 132 of the Mental Health Act. You tell them what their rights are, their right to an advocate. You'd also explain their right to an IMHA. So by IMHA, it's an Independent Mental Health Act advocate. This would be someone who's totally separate from the hospitals or the detaining authority that may support that patient to understand their rights or anything else that they might need as well. Another person who needs to be informed straight away is the nearest relative, and the nearest relative would need to be contacted by the AMP, but you'd also explain to the patient the rights of the nearest relative to argue against the detention power or to even support the detention power. Now, this is a different strand, but it's very important that the patient is aware of all those rights, and if they're not in agreement with the rights, then you can also explain to them that they've got a right to appeal against the section. Now, the appeal process would involve assigning a lawyer, and this lawyer will be someone again who is separate from the hospital, and it's someone who will support the patient to make sure that the hospital are meeting all the criteria for further detention under the Mental Health Act. If one needs to appeal against the session, it needs to be done within the first 14 days of detention of the Section 2 of the Mental Health Act. Now, once all those processes have taken place, treatment can commence under Section 2. In doing so, you need to make sure that certain other things are also happening within the Act, including capacity and consent to treatment. All these assessments are done by the doctors, the nurses support with all of that. And once they're detained, you'd need to make sure they're accepted in the detaining authority. And that usually involves a form called the H3 that then supports the detention and acceptance of that patient in the mental health institute that they've been detained to. Now, there are other various aspects that come within this, but to continue with the story and keep it simple, we would assume that the 28 days are now coming near an end. At this point, a doctor might need to make a decision. Now, some of the decisions that might come into place might be, does this person warrant further detention under the Mental Health Act? Or are they now at a point where they can agree to further treatment in the hospital? Or also, it might be a case of they've been detained way before the 28 days have come to anyway. Now, for the purpose of this situation, we're going to assume that it's somewhere in between the 28 days, and the patient says, actually, I'm now consenting to treatment. I'm much happier. I knew I've got a mental disorder, and I'm happy to continue treatment. At this point, detention is not warranted. So a doctor and the clinical team might decide to rescind the section, and the patient can be nursed on an informal basis, thus without any legal criteria for detention because they're accepting to stay in hospital. As an informal patient, you'd be free to go in and out of the hospital as much as you like. You'd be obviously conforming to some of the rules in the hospital. And in this situation, it's a collaborative work between yourselves and the patient. That's the most desirable nursing framework to nurse any patient because it's the least restrictive nursing framework to work with. But say now, for an example, the patient is informal and they've been working with you, but on one particular day, they say, I need to go out, but something has changed. They're now seeming to be mentally disordered, or something has changed in the sense that they might do something dangerous to the public, to themselves, as part of their mental disorder. As a nurse practitioner, you now need to make a decision. Can I release this person, allow them to go out and do something dangerous to themselves or others? Or do I need to keep them in the hospital? Now, if you're thinking they need to stay in the hospital, you need a legal framework to hold them, detain them again in the hospital on a nurse holding power. Now, the nurse holding power that allows you to do that is the section 5(4) of the Mental Health Act. And that allows you to keep that patient for up to 6 hours in the hospital to enable a doctor to come in and carry out a further assessment under the Mental Health Act. Now, in that 6 hours of stopping that patient from leaving the hospital, restricting that movement outside of the hospital, you'd need to call a doctor straight away, who would then carry out the further assessment under section 5(2) of the Mental Health Act. Now, within the section 5(2), a doctor will carry out a much more comprehensive assessment of the mental state, behavior, some of the things they're saying, some of the way they're behaving. And if it's thought that there's a need and it's proportionate and it's necessary to detain further, then the paperwork is filled out under section 5(2), and that section 5(2) would then trigger another referral to the Mental Health Act team to maybe detain again under a different section. Now, in this case, section 2 has already been used. The patient has become informal at some point. You've used the 5(4), you've used the 5(2), and at the moment, you've already established the person has got a mental disorder, you've got a treatment plan, so it's no longer appropriate to use the section 2 because the assessment has already been carried out. In many cases, what you might find is the AMP will come in and the 2 doctors will come in, they'll carry out their assessment, then they can detain under section 3 of the Mental Health Act, and that allows up to 6 months for treatment under the Mental Health Act. Now, with a section 3, you'd still go through the same processes, explaining the rights of the patient, giving them access to an advocate, talking to the nearest relative, giving them access to a lawyer, if they want to appeal against the section. All of this needs to happen. It's still the same process that you've gone through the section 2, it needs to happen for the section 3 as well. In fact, this has to happen for all of the sections or detention under the Mental Health Act. So now you've started the patient on a section 3, you've got your 6 months. What's very important here is you need to think about your consent to treatment, because at the point which the patient is now detained for anything over 3 months, you need to think about that consent to treatment, which can invoke either a T2 or a T3. Now, a T2 is where a patient is detained under the Mental Health Act for a period of 3 months. And in that period, if they have capacity and are consenting to treatment, you can use a T2 form. If they're lacking capacity, they have very little understanding of the medication or the treatment that's being offered, then you'd need to use a T3. All of this would then inform another doctor's second opinion approved doctor. In short, they would call them a SOWAD. And the SOWAD would come from the CQC or the regulatory body to come and carry out a further assessment to see whether the treatment being provided to the patient is appropriate in this instance. If that is all signed off and everything is going well, the SOWAD agrees with the treatment plan, then the T3 is in place. So section 3 will last up to 6 months, and again, in some cases beyond the 6 months, you can re-detain under the section 3 again, which would give you a further 6 months. And should it go for two consecutive detentions under section 3, the third time it would go for up to a year, and it goes on and so forth. Now, these are some of the most popular civil sections that are used. So far I've discussed 136, I've discussed nurse holding powers under 5(4), I've talked about doctors holding powers under section 5(2), I've talked about detention, for assessment and treatment, and that's section 2. Then we've then talked about section 3, which allows detention for treatment. I think for the purpose of this video, we should stop it right there, and we've talked about some of the civil sections. You will come across some other sections which are not so popular, or some parts of the legislative frameworks that are not so popular. So again, if you're someone who's very interested in all of the various sections, it would be worth looking at a 135 warrant when that's used. It would be also worth looking to 1352 warrant and when that's used and when that's appropriate. I think also for further reading, it's also worth looking at section 4 of the Mental Health Act and when that is used. It's not very often this is used, but it's worth looking into if you're interested in all of these things. These are some of the main core parts that you'd be involved with as a nurse, and some of the most popular sections used, the civil sections. At some point, we'll be discussing some of the other complex situations, forensic sections, for example, but that's a very different strand, and that can happen in a very different format. So that is something we can discuss in a different video. Hopefully that's been useful, just talking about it from a dynamic point of view, talking about it in a story format. I've tried not to prepare for this video, I've just tried to talk about it in a story format. Hopefully that's useful, because trying to look at the legislative framework in its core emphasis and looking at the code of conduct and all the other various parts of the Mental Health Act is a really big subject, and one short video does not suffice to explain this in its depth and in all its glory, really. If you've got any questions, any comments, throw them in the comments. Please subscribe, please like the videos, and I'll look forward to hearing what you guys think about the video formats. If you've got any ideas as well, please put in the comments and we'll look into that. Thank you for visiting our video, and we'll see you soon.